是誰為愛世人願捨身？這禮物化作活存的心靈，幸福是接受和活出這禮物的真諦，教我學習愛到痛時就如遇見主。人一生最如緊，豔陽縱使多耀眼，如若沒愛，彷彿天空阻隔了光線的障紋。請潔淨我心眼，長留着愛的恩泉，清澈璀璨。
加拿大嘅滿地可，一個以各式美食以及唔同節慶聞名嘅現代城市，喺370多年前啱啱開埠嘅時候，同現時有天淵之別。
17世紀中期，法國人嚟到呢度有聚居啦，佢就開始咗下邊一個城市，佢哋就叫命名咗嗰度咧 Ville Marie 瑪利亞之城。咁喺呢度俾我睇到咧，天主教嘅價值觀咧，就係建立呢一度嘅居民啊，呢度嘅城市咧嘅中心同埋基礎。
滿地可市中心西面有一座山，名為皇家山 Mount Royal。滿地可呢個名亦都係呢座山嘅法文名而嚟嘅。山上邊有一個著名嘅地標，佢就係一個高31米、闊11米嘅十字架。而呢個十字架對 Montreal 滿地可呢個地方嘅早期歷史好有關係。
其實喺歐洲好多嘅地方咧，好多嘅城市喺山上面都會建築一個十字架，係俾我哋居住喺呢度嘅人咧知道呢個地方咧係屬於天主嘅。至於呢個十字架咧，就係最初滿地可成立嘅時候係1642年嗰陣時，喺呢度嘅創始人 Paul，佢就見到好多水患嘅問題，咁就由天主承諾，如果天主幫佢哋可以退咗水患，佢就會喺呢度建咗個十字架，俾呢度最初嚟到嘅居民咧，知道我哋呢個地方係屬於天主庇蔭嘅地方。
事實上，滿地可亦出過好幾位天主教會冊封嘅聖人聖女，就等我哋睇下其中2位同樣叫 Margaret 嘅傑出女性，點樣為滿地可市嘅發展初期作出重要嘅貢獻。喺好多滿地可嘅居民眼中，聖 Marguerite Bourgeoys 聖瑪加利大波爾橋為呢個城市付出咗好多，大家都認為佢係滿地可市嘅其中一位創始人。聖瑪加利大波爾橋於1982年由聖若望保祿2世冊封為聖人。聖瑪加利大早喺1700年去世，但由佢一手建立以教育為使命嘅修會滿地可聖母會，到而家已經擴展到全球多個國家。嚟到滿地可，攝製隊有幸探訪修會位於市中心嘅會院。雖然聖瑪加利大從來冇喺呢度生活過，但係呢度嘅修女到而家仍然同佢有一份特別嘅聯繫。
This is the reliquary where we have the ashes of her heart. In that day and age, when she died in 1700, as a sign of respect, when a prominent person, someone was much loved, respected, died, the tradition was to remove their heart and to keep it like a relic. So Marguerite's heart was removed from her body and put in a coffer of some kind into the wall of the church. At some point in history, that church burned to the ground and only her ashes were left, the ashes of her heart, which are now in this relic.
喺牆上邊有一句佢生前講過嘅說話，用修會嘅4種官方語言法文、英文、日文、西班牙文寫咗出嚟，係佢一生嘅寫照。如果要認識滿地可嘅歷史，就必定要嚟到舊城嘅聖母座有小堂睇下。呢座小堂建築喺滿地可第一座石建小堂嘅地基上面， 小堂嘅大樓更加設有瞭望台，可以一覽成個滿地可舊城嘅風景。呢度亦都設有介紹聖女生平嘅博物館，透過精緻嘅手工藝將聖女嘅一生描繪出嚟。喺博物館嘅展品之中，最特別嘅就應該係聖瑪加利大嘅2幅肖像畫。聖母會修女本來收藏嘅呢幅肖像畫，喺1963年經由一位藝術專家鑑定，將表層嘅顏料刮去之後，竟然發現另外一幅肖像畫。呢幅畫描繪嘅先至係聖女本來嘅面貌。
So if you look at the one over here, I think the sister wanted to make Marguerite a little more pretty or something. But I think a woman who lived 80 years at that time, most women didn't live beyond 45 or 50, who crossed the ocean 7 times in very hard conditions, who lived in a fort for 5 years, and who lived in very difficult circumstances, and who worked exceedingly hard. I think that kind of looks like that kind of a woman.
聖瑪加利大波爾喬喺1620年出生於法國特魯亞嘅一個小康之家。佢出世嗰日就受洗成為天主教徒。
As a young girl, Marguerite Bourgeois was a pretty normal young girl. She had great love of fun. She loved pretty things. She liked jewelry. She liked all kinds of things that most teenagers like. And she used to gather people around to kind of teach them. She just sort of a natural thing within her that she was going to teach.
瑪加利大好自然咁成為一位教師，協助特魯亞聖母會嘅一班隱修女教育小朋友。喺瑪加利大21歲嗰年，有一次嘅聖堂巡遊當中，佢有一個好特別嘅經驗，改變咗佢一生。
They were processing around Troyes, and there was a church, a monastery, and over the portal was a statue of the Blessed Virgin. And during the procession, she looked up at the statue, and she had kind of an experience of conversion. In her writing, she calls it la touche, the touch.
由嗰一日開始，知道佢係要為天主做一啲嘢，而經常亦都會問天主：你想我做啲乜嘢？你想我點樣去服務你？咁亦都由嗰陣時開始咧，佢開始嚮往呢個修道嘅生活。
One of her spiritual directors in France said to her, "You know, the way of the Blessed Virgin, the journeying Virgin who went to visit her cousin in the visitation, Mary who went in haste to visit Elizabeth and to be of service to Elizabeth after she'd learned that Elizabeth was with child." Nobody is honoring that.
聖母訪親係唔係匿埋喺門後邊，而係出去將耶穌嘅喜訊帶俾其他嘅人。咁呢個係喺佢嘅嚟呢度之前喺法國嘅時候，好深刻咁感受到聖母俾佢嘅召叫。
And so Marguerite wanted to be an apostolic sister. She did not want to be cloistered because she wanted to journey and be able to go out to people and meet the people where they were and respond to their needs.
特魯亞聖母會當時由路易斯修女管理，佢嘅弟弟就係滿地可市嘅創始人保祿梅桑納夫。1652年，保祿去到特魯亞探望佢2位姊妹，嗰陣時佢正物色緊一位願意去到滿地可嘅教師。路易斯修女就向佢推薦咗瑪加利大。講返轉頭，滿地可最初被命名為瑪利亞之城 Ville Marie。係因為起初由法國嚟到拓展呢個地方嘅人，本來就想建立一個以基督信仰為核心嘅地方。
What they really wanted was that they would be able to found a community here in Ville Marie, which would model itself on the first Christian community as described in the Acts of the Apostles. Their purpose in coming to Ville Marie, believe it or not, it's hard to believe that today, but in those days was to come and to evangelize the people here.
得知滿地可當時嘅需要，瑪加利大願意遠赴加拿大服務。
佢喺法國可以好安逸，可以好安全，可以好舒適嘅快樂嘅生活。佢知道天主有個召叫，擺咗呢粒種子，佢知道要回應呢樣嘢。 直至到佢準備嚟加拿大嘅時候，佢都有少少忐忑嘅。就佢嘅經歷就係聖母同佢講一番説話，就係話你去咧唔好害怕。咁呢啲係奠定咗佢呢個使徒，好似聖母係派遣緊佢出去，係聖母話俾佢知，天主係想派遣嚟。咁就係呢個 mystical， 呢個好神秘同天主嘅同聖母嘅一個經歷咧，係好似一粒種子啊！一粒蘊藏咗好多天主嘅力量，天主嘅安排，天主嘅臨在嘅一粒種子咧，就擺咗喺呢一個先驅嘅內心深處。OK， 我要回應呢樣嘢，咁佢就越洋過海就去做呢樣嘢。當 Marguerite Bourgeoys 最初嚟到嘅時候咧，佢知道咧，明白到為咗當時法國嚟到嘅居民咧有一個好嘅基礎咧，去了解到佢哋嘅信仰要有一啲標記。咁第一樣嘢咧就係有人帶咗佢上嚟睇呢個十字架。咁當時嘅十字架咧係俾一啲比較激進嘅原居民咧係破壞咗。咁佢哋都盡快咧就安排咧就修葺翻呢個十字架，等呢度嘅人知道咧呢個地方咧係天主所保護嘅。
瑪加利大嚟到滿地可嘅目的係為咗教育呢度嘅小朋友，點知嚟到先至發現竟然冇小朋友可以教。
Marguerite came to teach the children. Conditions were exceedingly hard. The children in the very beginning did not survive. So Marguerite put her hand to many, many things. She did everything that was needed to be done.
由於當時嘅滿地可只不過係一條小小嘅鄉村，唯一可供朝聖嘅地方就係山上面嘅十字架。瑪加利大就組織居民建築一間小聖堂。
While she was waiting for the school to become and the children to be available to teach, she began to collect some stones to build this chapel. She said, we need a site of pilgrimage. Pilgrimages were in vogue in France at that time. People wanted to go to pilgrimages. There was a whole renewal in France at that time, renewal of seminary formation. So Marguerite said, we're going to gather some stones and we're going to build ourselves a chapel of pilgrimage.
而家嘅聖堂就係建築喺瑪加利大當年籌建嘅聖堂嘅舊址上面，佢嘅墓亦都係放咗喺呢個聖堂裏面。喺1658年，瑪加利大終於收到佢首批嘅學生。學校嘅校舍就係一間長36尺、闊18尺，由保祿捐贈嘅石屋。呢一間就係滿地可第一間學校。
And it was in a stable that the Maisonneuve gave to Marguerite. And the stable had been actually housing animals. Marguerite herself, with a few of the children, cleaned it out. And it was not a very big place, but it was quite avant-garde.
去教育佢哋，唔單止係教育啲女仔，喺一個氣候係覺得啲女仔唔需要讀書嘅環境之下，佢唔單止係教佢哋嗰啲針織或者做一啲家務，去堅持要教佢哋點樣讀書，堅持去教佢哋點樣去做好多其他嘅嘢，賦予翻佢哋一個能力咧，就係佢哋有價值嘅，唔係冇用嘅。
Now we're talking mid-1600s. And they also had Amerindian children, native children in there. So it was a very inclusive school for its time.
教育固然係瑪加利大最大嘅使命，但係有趣嘅係佢亦都造就咗唔少嘅姻緣。同好多啱啱開發嘅地方一樣，當時嘅魁北克省嘅人口只得2-3千人，男女比例嚴重失衡。喺1663至1673年期間，為咗增加殖民地嘅人口，當時法國嘅國王路易14贊助咗一批年輕女仔，由法國移民嚟到魁北克市同滿地可。呢啲女仔被稱為國王嘅女兒。
喺嗰個年代，喺法國亦都係過嚟嘅女仔咧，有好多係孤兒啦。呢邊最初建立呢個團體嘅、建立呢個城市嘅人咧，佢哋過嚟係斬樹嘅，係一啲勞動嘅男仔啊，係年青嘅男士，但係冇妻子嘅，因為過咗嚟之後全部都係男人啊，咁所以法國好多過嚟嘅呢班女仔咧過到嚟，好容易佢可以好簡單就係話，哦，你過到嚟有俾個地方你住 咁跟住咧就安排個地方俾呢度做嘢嘅男士咧去認識佢哋，咁佢哋娶咗佢咧，咁佢唔使擔心任何嘢。但係佢話唔可以咁樣，因為好危險，為呢啲女仔過到嚟咧，佢好多心靈上嘅需要啊。
They really needed someone with some experience to live with them. And she moved with them, lived with them. She became a pre-marriage counselor. She interviewed the fellows, tried to help them make sure that they were going to be compatible. I mean, she was really a matchmaker.
I suspect there were a lot of those little young women that did a fair bit of crying on Marguerite's shoulders. They had left home, they knew nobody, it was hard, times were difficult. Many of them might have had children very young, and many of the children died in the beginning.
咁所以一開始咧，佢就好照顧呢一啲好有需要嘅人，好快就做咗佢哋嘅大家姐，甚至呢度嘅人好快就叫咗佢做當咗一個母親。
要發展滿地可嘅教育，瑪嘉利大需要尋找一啲志同道合嘅女士，而要確保教育事業能夠繼續維持落去，佢哋嘅團體必須得到承認。為咗建立團體同尋求法國國王嘅批准，瑪嘉利大多次往返法國。
單人匹馬翻去法國，咁嗰陣時嘅呢個橫跨呢個大西洋嘅旅程好危險啊！佢橫跨咗唔止一程，佢橫跨咗前後3次來回，到佢需要擴展佢嘅教育啦，想有個保障佢死後都可以有一個繼續係一個持久嘅一個機構喺度啦。佢1670年冇錢嘅情況之下，佢自己又係一個女仔上船翻去法國。今次仲勇敢去見皇帝，去見法國皇帝，去要求佢俾佢一個名銜，俾呢個學校一個名銜，俾佢個團體一個名銜。咁嗰陣時係冇人咁樣做嘅，去到要見皇帝，又俾佢見到皇帝，唔單止係咁樣，皇帝仲俾咗個patent， 俾咗個諭令俾佢，立定咗佢哋嘅學校。
瑪嘉利大仲要面對另一個難題，佢哋嘅團體即使喺教會裏面，亦都冇一個明確嘅身份。
When she realized that there was a need for women to be consecrated to this, she herself felt called to make the private vows even. The bishop only knew about cloistered congregations. At that time in the church, people like us did not exist.
到下一個主教繼任啦，到1685年之後啦，第二任呢邊嘅主教開始去見到你哋呢班女士教育好成功，同埋佢哋唔係就係教育，係真係愛嗰啲人，真係賦予佢所教育嘅男女係一個生命，一個學習去愛其他人，去奉獻嗰個精神嘅時候咧，呢個主教就好感動。結果終於喺佢臨死之前2年，1698年咧，俾咗一個名銜佢哋，正式成立咗佢哋一個修會，係一個喺加拿大嚟講，喺北美嚟講咧，第一個唔係隱修嘅女修會。
除咗滿地可聖母會嘅創辦人聖瑪嘉利大波爾喬之外，滿地可仲有另一位聖瑪嘉利大，佢就係 Saint Margaret Duville， 聖瑪嘉利大杜維爾。聖瑪嘉利大杜維爾係第一位喺加拿大出生嘅聖女。喺1959年，佢獲宣真福。當時任教宗嘅聖若望23世稱佢為普世仁愛之母。
聖瑪嘉烈 Duville 佢最初喺呢度開始嘅年代咧，係1701至1771嗰段時間咧，本身嗰陣時其實滿地可都係發展中，嗰陣時仲係好細。Margaret Duville 咧，佢喺呢度佢最大嘅貢獻咧，就係佢設立咗醫院啦，佢設立咗好多輔助啲弱勢社群嘅呢間我哋叫做社會工作設施啦。嗰陣時亦都未有呢一個概念。咁 Margaret Duville 喺加拿大嚟講，可以話係創始咗呢個 social welfare 社會工作social works 同埋好多幫殘疾窮寡婦孤兒，加拿大係今時今日可以喺呢一方面算係領先，有一個好深厚嘅價值觀喺輔助所有有需要或者邊緣嘅人士呢一方面嘅發展咧，可以話歸功於當年 Margaret Duville 開始 一班嘅婦女走埋一齊咧，去幫最有需要嘅人。
呢度就係法漢，距離滿地可大概20多公里，係瑪加利大嘅出生地。呢度就有間博物館，講述咗佢嘅生平事蹟。呢度亦有一座大殿，裡面有聖瑪加利大嘅墳墓。
Here they did this tomb with the Marguerite because of her name. Daisies in French, it's Marguerite. That's why there's the flowers a lot of time. And in her hands, she has a broken one. It's about the people that she helps that are broken.
Marguerite Durville 本身佢嘅背景咧係算係出身於上流社會啦，好可惜佢好細個嘅時候咧，佢父親就死咗。Marguerite 佢好細嘅時候咧，你經歷咗貧困嘅痛苦，佢就學識咗點樣喺好實際嘅方法咧去幫助佢嘅屋企。
瑪加利大20歲結婚，可惜佢嘅婚姻並唔愉快。
佢結咗婚唔係一個好嘅婚姻，係一個受迫害嘅婚姻。佢丈夫好多嘅問題，佢丈夫嘅媽媽好多嘅問題，佢婚姻某程度上係一個失敗，同埋因為佢丈夫佢係同嗰啲原居民賣酒啊，同埋佢自己出邊嘅賭博啊，同埋好多啲咁嘢，咁佢變咗佢丈夫死咗之後咧，佢自己要撐起條家，受咗好多嘅社會上嘅譏諷。
瑪加利大嘅一生經歷咗好多痛苦。但苦難並冇令到佢怨天尤人，反而令到佢對於別人嘅需要特別敏感。滿地可雖然當時已經設有醫院，但就淨係收難病人，需要援助嘅女性孤立無援。咁
大約佢丈夫死咗7年嘅時候咧，就係因為佢好多時喺街嗰度去幫嗰啲窮人，專揾嗰啲最有需要啊、病倒嘅人啊。咁就係因為咁樣咧，嗰陣時就吸引咗幾位女士咧。見到哇，佢真係彰顯到天主嘅愛，真係幫到人嘅時候咧，就吸引咗佢哋同佢一齊。咁最早期咧就吸引咗，特別係3個女士咧，就同佢一齊住埋咗一齊，將佢嘅屋企打開咗，做一個俾窮人嚟可以有啲嘢食啊。特別係有啲女士係無家可歸啊，冇辦法可以維生嘅人咧，就開始喺佢嗰度住。咁因為咁樣咧，就開始咗佢哋最早期嘅佢哋嘅一個團體。
喺1737年嘅除夕，佢哋4個奉獻自己俾天主，承諾要服務喺窮苦人身上嘅耶穌。
When she decided to have some poor in her house and begin her congregation, that was not a congregation at that time. Even her family, members of her family were denying her, and the people on the streets. She was not well treated and well respected.
瑪加利大創立嘅修會正式嘅名係滿地可仁愛女修會。本地嘅人大部分稱佢哋為 Grey Nuns， 即係灰色修女。呢班修女之所以有呢個特別嘅稱號，原來同瑪加利大同佢嘅同伴初期所受嘅嘲諷有莫大關係。
事實上咧，當時因為佢哋呢一班女士咧，冇人知道佢哋做乜嘢啊。4個女人會住埋一齊，會去幫一啲冇人理嘅人。咁好多人都會誤解佢哋，懷疑佢哋之前佢嘅丈夫賣酒啊，咁變咗好多人都會嘲笑呢4個女人咧係自己收埋啲酒喺裏邊飲醉啊，所以就取笑佢哋咧叫做 Sœur Glisse 啊 ，Sœur Glisse 就 Sœur 就係 sister 咧 ，Glisse 咧就係有2個解釋嘅，一個就係灰色嘅意思，另外一個解釋咧喺嗰陣時法文嘅一啲嘅俚語裏邊咧就解釋係飲醉咗佢，咁所以就其實係嘲笑呢幾個女人咧，就係一啲飲醉咗嘅修女。咁但係咧，佢哋就話啊，唔係飲醉咗，佢哋話我哋只不過係喺聖神裏邊飲醉咗，為愛天主所以飲醉咗。
瑪加利大同佢嘅同伴好唔容易建立起小小嘅團體，不過1745年嘅一場大火就將佢哋間屋燒毀，但係大火冇摧毀佢哋嘅意志。1747年，當時嘅滿地可公立醫院面臨破產，瑪加利大勸服咗市長，俾佢搬到去公立醫院嗰度服務。就喺嗰陣時開始，醫院唔再淨係服務男病人。
咁佢喺呢個醫院開始去重新去整頓嘅時候咧，佢第一個突破就係容許唔單止男士咧，而女士亦都開咗一個特別嘅地方俾佢哋，佢可以喺呢度住啦，同埋尋醫嘅。咁亦都可以孩子啊，同埋啲冇錢嘅，同埋啲原居民啊，好多窮困嘅人亦都可以得到適當嘅治理。
接管公立醫院之後，瑪嘉利大仍然面對重重困難。1757年，佢曾經有過一場大病，幾乎令佢冇命。1760年英法戰爭之後，滿地可落入英國人手中，令瑪嘉利大同眾多親友分離。1765年，公立醫院發生大火，令當時住喺醫院嘅超過100人流離失所。但呢次打擊依然冇摧毀瑪嘉利大嘅意志，佢決定重建醫院。嗰年佢已經64歲。
喺Marguerite Duvier 嘅身上，我哋睇到咧就係唔單止佢冇放棄啊，特別係醫院即係燒嘅時候啊，即係佢投資咗咁多，嗰陣時已經被社會公認咗、接受咗啦。令佢身邊嗰啲修女都有少少覺得好沮喪嘅時候咧，佢竟然可以企出嚟話我哋唔好放棄，唔好擔心，反而佢藉着天主佢對佢嘅信任，將腐朽化成神奇，將絕望化成希望。佢嘅一生俾我哋睇到，佢係完全依賴咗天主越無比嘅施予。生裏邊無論佢受咗幾多挫折，都俾我哋睇到，原來依靠天主，原來相信仁愛會戰勝黑暗，係會帶嚟一次又一次不斷天主賜予嘅奇蹟。
喺17、18世紀期間，女性社會地位唔高嘅環境之下，兩位聖瑪嘉利大藉着信靠天主，本着仁愛精神，為滿地可同加拿大早期嘅發展寫下新嘅一頁。咁為我哋又有乜嘢啟示呢？
愛就係要建築喺日常嘅生活裏邊，我哋身邊最親嘅人嗰度開始，我哋愛到我哋身邊嘅人咧，願意去有耐性多啲啊，願意去關懷多啲啊，願意去諒解多啲啊，願意去明白多啲嘅時候，自自然然就產生咗個動力，自然又產生咗一個更大嘅胸襟咧，去愛出邊冇人理嘅人，自然有更大嘅勇氣咧，去付出，自然就可以跨過，可以突破我哋種種嘅困難。
喺呢9年入邊，我可以話冇一日我係冇吸毒。
幾經辛苦擺脫毒癮，佢發現自己嘅生命可能好快結束。
哎呀，中招啊！今次死啊！
冇諗到呢一個警號嘅背後，竟然係天主柔和嘅呼喚。
我慢慢發現到天主嘅美。
Hawkins 嘅生命點樣因為信靠天主而出現180度嘅轉變呢？請留意呢一個星期嘅愛常傳。
睇完呢一集愛常傳，歡迎大家打我哋嘅熱線電話嚟分享一下你嘅感受或者故事，同時亦請收聽我哋逢星期六嘅電台節目愛生命。要購買天主教書籍同信仰靈修禮品，請嚟我哋嘅生命恩泉書社參觀選購。我哋下星期同樣時間再見，天主保佑。